Oh, good. Good.
But we will start the panel in earnest now. It's 12:01. Welcome to the Gauntlet Con panel, where we are planning to discuss Dungeon World 2nd Edition, or Advanced Dungeon World, whatever you want to call it. And is it something that needs to happen, or do we hope that it will happen? If we do hope it will happen, what do we hope it will be like? And what are some dangers or things that we don't want it to be like? Here with me today is largely from the Dungeon World Discord community, Cameron Burns, who has been working feverishly on Worlds of Adventure, which is, well, he could say more about it, but I've read it, and I think it's a very interesting project, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it grows in the days to come. Yochai Gal, who is also one of the chief organizers, or the organizer of the Dungeon World Discord, and he keeps up with the Dungeon World syllabus, which is a terrific resource if you are looking for just about anything Dungeon World, from starters to best advice and practice tips. Anything you can imagine is listed on that syllabus in an easy to find format, so you can get the most out of your Dungeon World experience. And then also with me is Jeremy Strandberg of the Stone Top Legend, the ongoing project where he has, I've come to understand, recently finished his 50th campaign session with the same group. So Stone Top is a Dungeon World hack that has taken on a life of its own and become a terrific thing. I just had the pleasure of finishing the third part in a 3-part long con where we played Stone Top, where Jeremy was running it. It's fantastic. I'm David Lafreniere. I am the co-host of the Discern Realities podcast, and I help out with Codex, which produces a lot of Dungeon World content, and that's why I'm here, because I love Dungeon World, and I think that's why we're all here, because we care about Dungeon, we love Dungeon World, and we want to discuss kind of what might happen next. So kind of a softball question to get things going. If you had to pick a playbook and that was going to be your playbook for forever and ever, or your favorite playbook, which one would you pick? We'll start on my screen on the left where Cameron is and move to the right.
Hello, nice to meet you all. I would probably say that my favorite playbook is the Barbarian. It's Herculean Appetites has a unique mechanic in the game and a unique role in the game. So probably that.
Nice. It's a good pick. So Cameron's our Barbarian. Jeremy, what do you got?
I was going to say the Barbarian, just because I think it's such a an evocative playbook, right? I think they just hit that one out of the park as far as doing something different than the standard D&D Barbarian, but harkening back to, like you can just see Conan and Red Sonja and like Logan Nine Fingers just hanging out in that playbook, and I think that's a really distinct thing. But since that's already taken, I'll go with the Fighter, not because I think it's necessarily the best playbook, but because the best characters that I can remember in vanilla Dungeon World that I've ever had at my table have all been fighters. Something about that playbook just always brings out the bold and the brash and the over the top in the people that play it.
Awesome. And Yochai?
So obviously, I would have also picked the Barbarian because I really like what it. I mean, it's true. If you had started with me, that's totally what I would have said. But my second favorite to have at my table when I'm a GM is actually the Artificer playbook, which is one of the playbooks from Jacob Randolph's alternative playbook, blah blah blah, whatever they're called. Only because, and this is, a lot of people don't like this playbook, but I like it because it forces the player to create alongside the GM in a really interesting way. It's like you made a playbook out of adventuring gear. I don't know. I really like it. It's my favorite to play personally as well. But besides the Barbarian.
That's a really
Right.
good description. Making a playbook out of just adventuring gear. That's pretty apt. I like that. I did not pick the Barbarian. I didn't know you are all such big fans of the Barbarian playbook, but there it is. I would have to say the Mage playbook from the same supplements. I love the Mage.
It's the hardest to GM for, that playbook. It's because I ran it once when this with this guy who on level 1 ended up reversing time, but then also almost killing the entire party. It was just like way too much power. It's way too OP, as they always call it. So that's my opinion, but it's still a great playbook.
As the kids call it, Yohai.
That's what the kids say.
As
Yeah.
the kids say. Yeah, I've heard that critique, and I think that is a valid critique. But I think if you have good, if you have a GM who's familiar with it and a player who is willing to work with the GM, and there's some trust at the table, you can do some amazing things with it. But yeah, it's tough if you're just playing with new folks and you have no familiarity with it. All right, let's move into our question. First of all, I mean, does anyone think there should not be a Dungeon World 2nd edition?
I think there's some definite question as to whether there could be and what the value of one being is, right? Because you have to first ask yourself, where would a 2nd edition come from? And you've got Adam and Sage, who made who made it, right? They gave it to us, and they gave this to the community as an open source thing. But they do own the trademark and the name Dungeon World. I think Yohai, you and Cameron, I think you two ran into this when you were talking about Worlds of Adventure. That didn't they say something like you can't, you just can't call it Dungeon World?
That is exactly what Adam said. Yeah, it's well, we originally were going to call it Dungeon World when this was a different thing that wasn't all Cameron's. When it was just a bunch of us on the Discord. Which, by the way, I'm not the main person on the Discord. I'm just one of the moderators, and I happen to talk a lot. But when we first started looking at Dungeon World Revised, there was partly a miscommunication, which I'm sure Cameron can talk more about. But in the end, it was, yeah, you just can't call it that. And then when we all decided to call it Worlds of Adventure, it turned out that Vincent Baker is making a game called World of Adventure. We had no idea, but we actually got his permission, and we're first. So, or yeah.
All right. IP law aside, imagine a world where you could just have somebody out there creating something called Dungeon World 2nd edition or Advanced Dungeon World or something. What do you think that's something that like there would be value in? I think that was a good way of putting it, Jeremy. Or what value would you be looking for if there was going to be a 2nd edition?
If you guys don't mind, I was thinking about this question, like just in terms of framing the conversation. And as you know, I put out that poll to see what the community thought, and it's overwhelmingly, I think it's should there be a Dungeon World 2nd edition? It's 69.7% of respondents said yes, and then a whole bunch said yes ifs and stuff. So about 70% of the community thinks there should be a 2nd edition for various reasons. But I think the main argument for having one is what does the effect of a RPG? What does the effect of a 2nd edition have on the greater RPG community? Like, why, for example, if I just literally cloned the game, made some changes, and called it something else, why is that different than saying Dungeon World 2nd edition? And I think the difference, personally, if I could answer this question first, is having a 2nd edition is like a way of reviving a community. Like I've seen it happen in other editions. I've also seen it destroy communities, like with 4th edition D&D, but not destroy, but fragment and even with 3rd edition. But yeah, so the question is, does having a 2nd edition version of Dungeon World have a net positive impact on the Dungeon World community, and why? That's what I really want to understand before even being able to talk about it. But yeah. Okay,
then we can start the conversation there. That's valid. Just for the viewers, how many respondents did we get for that poll?
99 as of today, and I posted it publicly like 4 days ago or something. But yeah, 100.
Okay, So that's a pretty good return for a 4-day post. That's pretty solid.
Yeah, I also only posted it to like half the community first and then the other half later. I just wasn't thinking. So it's not even really it could have been better, but.
But I think your observation of reviving, like the ability of a second edition to sort of breathe new life and revive a community is really astute, right? Like I think that is the biggest overall benefit that I think could happen from particularly one that was actually an official Dungeon World 2.0, like a second edition. I think it would have that breathe some new oxygen into the air. Which makes me a little bit skeptical about whether or not we'll get or anything that didn't have Dungeon World in the name as a second edition, whether or not it would get the same sort of foothold and whether it would be able to sort of push over the inertia of what's already there.
Right. Of course. I mean, the name is important. Like, there's a reason everybody knows, like, or when everybody thinks of role-playing games, they think of Dungeons and Dragons. Very, very, like, people who don't know what it is, they know what Dungeons and Dragons is supposed to be. So yeah, the name, of course, is an important feature of it. It's interesting that you say, like, yeah, this could breathe new life into a community or potentially fragment a community. I was not around for D&D shifting. I've actually not ever played proper D&D, if I'm being honest. I've played Pathfinder, and that was enough for me to know, like, I don't want to play that Roll20 system. There's too much for me going on there. Too many fiddly bits.
Well, Jeremy calls it Mathfinder. Isn't that right, Jeremy? You say Mathfinder?
I don't think I've ever said that.
Maybe it was Ray.
I mean, I might have, but it's certainly not my creation if I have.
Oh yeah, okay.
Well, in any case, yeah, so I always thought of it, I never thought of it in this breathing new life. I always thought of it as, like, improving upon. Like, there's been a lot of development in PBTA games since Dungeon World came out, and there were intentionally things that were reminiscent of Dungeons and Dragons to, I suppose, to make it familiar for the converted player. And all of these advancements and maybe these vestigial things, like, would it warrant, like, a second edition to just improve upon for the community and breathe new life into it? I don't know, Cameron, we haven't heard from you on this topic. What do you think?
I personally feel like there's a lot of, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of developments that have been made over the course of, like, since Dungeon World's original release. We're seeing a lot of games that implement bonds or something similar to bonds, for example, and that's a mechanic that's often been viewed as a something that Dungeon World could have improved upon, and I think some of those things could be brought back into the game quite easily and improved upon with a second edition in a way that probably wouldn't fragment the community.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, no, I mean, that's definitely true. Like, I don't disagree with that at all. I think let's just assume that we could put it together in such a way that it was presented as an official descendant, right? And there's just so many things that we have all seen, right? Drives instead of alignment, or at least as a baked-in option. Flags as an option that would be, having it there as something that could be easily actually baked in. But also things like if I remember correctly, the survey results, Yohai, the number of people that were dissing on the fronts chapter, or at least how it's written.
Yeah, more than anything else. Right? Yeah, more than anything. That was, like, number one feedback was no one hates, either you hate fronts entirely, which I don't, I love fronts, or you just think it's written really poorly. Yeah.
And it also it's got that vestigial quality, even the term fronts, right? Just sort of, it inherited that from Apocalypse World, which I think it's really interesting that in Apocalypse World 2.0 or second edition, Vincent dropped the notion of fronts and just that now there are just threats. And I ended up doing the same thing with Stone Top, and it just works a lot more cleanly to have dangers, right, or threats, or however you phrase them, that are just sort of placed on a map, or placed in a scenario, and not necessarily have this notion of trying to put them into this front that's named this. And I think just little things like that would be great to just get like a revision and a cleanup that does that kind of thing. Maybe it tosses a lot of the steading stuff. Maybe it, I think examples, right, would be the other big thing that the game could really, really use a polishing up of the examples. And I think a rewrite of the GM chapter as well would be a big one.
The GM guide that everyone refers to, which is like a little bit out of date because it's based on playtest documents before the Kickstarter, is still by far the best Dungeon World, GM manual out there. And it's like an added supplement. It's like a PDF, and there's different language versions of it that I'd love to like steal from and make. Like we were talking in the Discord not that long ago about making a player's guide, because for new players it can also be daunting. Like, so yeah, examples and advice and some cleanup of some of the mechanics, like you said, fronts being renamed with threat or just using threats, that's all like just would be helpful and not really change the rules at all. And but then there's also the greater conversation of would the second edition make some major changes, like people are always talking about alignment, how much they hate alignment. And like the majority of players that I know play with drives, not alignment. Like alignment is the least popular, I think, of the core mechanics that people throw away right away. And even I play with drives and I have no problem with alignment. I just think the drives that you made, Jeremy, are just much more interesting. And maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe alignment should stay alignment, but still have maybe better examples or something. Like some of the mechanics we could keep and then just enhance. Like there's a lot of conversation that could happen there. So yeah, I agree.
It does sort of lead us into the conversation of how much can change mechanically before it stops being Dungeon World, right? Because you've already got, the sort of like the Labyrinth Lord to Dungeons and Dragons out there, or you've got various things that are like Labyrinth Lord to Dungeons and Dragons. Like Freebooters is the one that immediately jumps to mind. And it's kind of too bad that Jason couldn't make it. But I mean, what he's done is taken, a lot of the DNA of Dungeon World, but made a different game that is definitely not Dungeon World. But a lot of the same approach applies, a lot of the same mindset applies, but it very much has a different set of rules and a different mentality, and it's definitely its own game. And so there's that, but there's also there's steps along the way to that a Dungeon World 2.0 could look like, and I think it's worth talking about what the sacred cows would be,
yeah.
Right? Of like what you couldn't lose.
Like, what's the point of Dungeon World? Like, what is the point? And I think a lot of like PBTA nerds who hate Dungeon World, their argument is it's not PBTA because X, Y, and Z, even though it obviously is. And then there's some D&D folks who think, it's not D&D, or OSR the folks who say it's not OSR, when it's really just a mix of all those things. But that's not the point. The point was to just emulate D&D in a way that the creators thought better did a certain job. Like it better displayed the kind of D&D you thought D&D was when you were a kid, or or maybe the alternative was, just to make a fantasy PBTA that kind of emulated D&D. And I think the emulation of D&D is core to that. What is Dungeon World? Which is why, even though I prefer having just simple modifiers like +1, +2 to ability score, I do think keeping the ability scores as they are named is core to any second edition. It just has to happen. Even though I think Constitution sucks and isn't used enough, like it has to be used in some way, because the point, or at least as I understand it, one of the points of making Dungeon World was to make a system that emulated D&D, and you can't have D&D without the 6 ability scores. It's just it's true for almost every retro clone too. So anyways, that's
I'm with you on that one. Like, to me, the things that have to be there before, in order for it to stay identifiably as Dungeon World, would be the 6 stats. Not necessarily. I agree with you that the scores, like the 3 to 18 scores, could disappear and no one would really notice. Hit points, randomized damage, class-based playbooks that have at least the fighter, the thief, the wizard, and the cleric, right? Like those are something along those same lines need to be there.
No
And interestingly,
emulator.
what's that?
No emulator.
No emulators.
Rip that shit out. Either rip it out or take Cameron's branded and use that. I don't care, but no emulator.
But interestingly, the other one that I think makes Dungeon World, and I think you would lose it if it was, you would lose some of the identity if you lost it, is Last Breath. And even though that doesn't have anything to do with D&D, right? There's no emulation of old school D&D or of any edition of D&D baked into Last Breath, but it has become such a touchstone for Dungeon World and such an important part of it.
Like failing forward too. Like if you removed, like a lot of people hate giving XP for, or they don't like giving XP for failing. That's like a thing people want to take out in certain hacks of Dungeon World I've seen. And to me, that's an identifiable part of Dungeon World that people just know about. And when I introduce former D&D types to Dungeon World, that's the first thing that they latch onto as being new and different. You know, like that's really crazy that you get XP when you fail in a roll. Like, even though I might have different opinions about how to apply and get XP, I actually think that is core to the concept of Dungeon World, from my perspective.
I hadn't thought about that, but I would agree.
I think it's an important tool for keeping the player GM relationship more amicable, which I think is something that, if I'm being honest, like games that were more classic, in my experience, have been more adversarial and felt that way. But I've not felt that way in Dungeon World. And I think getting XP on a miss is part of that. So I agree. I think it is an important part of what Dungeon World was. I don't know if it needs to be there forever and ever, but I do think that I like it personally, but I don't know. I agree. Like all of the core playbooks need to be in there. I think the 6 stats need to be in there for a variety of reasons. And so those would all be things that I would look for. So what other improvements would you want to see if there was going to be a second edition? We talked about adding on more options for drives versus alignments. We can kind of talk about that maybe in a little bit, like what are some risks that might be associated with creating a second edition.
I actually, before we move into that, David, if you don't mind, Cameron, I know World of Adventures tends to move away from a lot of these things. And I know that you've been a proponent of something other than XP on a miss. So like, and I think even you dropped con and you changed the stats around in World of Adventures. So do you think that a Dungeon World 2.0, that those things would be sacred cows to it? Or do you think that that they could go and still be Dungeon World?
I think with the goal of Dungeon World being to emulate the feel of D&D, a lot of the mechanical things, while very much important, are not vital. But to keep something Dungeon World, you'd want, say, the Last Breath move and HP, and you'd still want those core 6 stats because that keeps it Dungeon World. For a lot of content, to use the example of Apocalypse World and its second edition, a lot of playbooks, homebrew playbooks for Apocalypse World first edition still work in the second edition just fine. It's just you might have to revise how you manage hex when you create the new character, or you might need to update a gear option or something like that. But you've still got the same 5 stats, and you've still got harm and all that other stuff. Like death works differently, but not that differently. Worlds of Adventure is a bit of an interesting case in that I've started moving in 2 different directions lately. I've got a version that has discarded the new stats, and I'm looking to re-release that version I released about a year ago, I think. That is just the updated classes and moves that are as compatible as possible with the existing Dungeon World content that exists. Perilous Wilds, Class Warfare, Grimworld, Inverse World, all that supplementary stuff, all that homebrew content. I think a lot can be done to make stats like Constitution meaningful without having to revamp everything.
Okay. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, that you would largely agree that an actual Dungeon World identity would still need a lot of those sacred cows.
I think it would be. I think Dungeon World would lose something if it moved to more standard playbooks, for example, that had only 6 moves between them.
Sure.
I think it would lose something if it had harm instead of HP.
Yeah.
The 16 HP dragon is a touchstone in the community, after all.
Which I am going to go. I'll go on record as saying I think is overrated.
Oh, well, yes.
You know what? That's not fair, because that document, like when I read it, I didn't. It wasn't revelatory, but sharing it has so quickly explained fictional positioning for me that, I mean, there are other like OSR blog posts about fictional positioning that I think are probably better, but that one's about Dungeon World. So when someone starts and they're like, "Oh, how do I do this?" that really makes a difference. I think it's.
I know. I just like.
Got a rag on the 16 hit point dragon. Talk about a sacred cow.
Yeah, really.
I think I got a blog post coming up soon of the 20 hit point dragon. But anyway, I one of the things that Cameron, that you said that struck a chord with me, that maybe we talk about this more in the risks topic later, David, is the idea of backwards compatibility, because there's a ton of content out there, and I think that is a risk.
That's definitely something I wanted to talk about when we talk about the, what are the risks. That's huge point on that. So before we move there, though, is there anything else that folks would hope to see or want to see? Personally, I wouldn't mind seeing the playbook streamlined a bit. I think there are moves that never get touched, and they don't get touched for a reason. Not to say like you couldn't write different moves, but I think there are some moves in there that like could be better, could be different to make them more fictionally interesting as opposed to mechanically beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Like there are there are moves for the bard that are possibly interesting, but you can handle through the fiction because the bard is already this social person. You don't need a move that says any port in the storm, because that's cool, but there's like maybe something more you could do with it. I feel like that's a great example, only because it illustrates one of the core strengths and weaknesses of Dungeon World, which is that you can rely on the fiction coming first instead of moves. You can say, well, you're the bard, you would know. But at the same time, moves help reinforce that and give you the special abilities. And I feel like just redoing them just like a little bit, just going through each one and kind of updating some of the moves, made them more interesting, even some of the basic moves. But before we go on and talk about what I think we should do, I want to say one more sacred cow that comes up a lot, and I was just looking at how many times it came up in the poll. Vancian style magic for the wizard and the cleric too, I guess. But Vancian magic is a sacred cow of D&D. Even with whether you're talking about the wizard or sorcerer or whatever class from D&D, in Dungeon World, having Vancian style magic, it seems like everyone hates it. And I also went through a period where I hated it until I kind of realized it was kind of good. But I think keeping Vancian style magic, because it's a sacred cow, is a good idea, but not just because it's sacred cow. I also think it's a really cool way of showing some of the strengths of Dungeon World, which is it lets the player be the best wizard they can be. Unlike in D&D, where you can barely do anything for half the time that you're the wizard because you forgot the spell because you chose one spell that day and then it's gone forever. But in D&D, you lose, or in Dungeon World, you lose a spell if you roll a 7 and 9 and you choose that option, instead of in D&D where it's like, nope, that spell is gone. Sorry. So what I'm saying is I really like keeping the wizard because it shows how the system is more player focused than other similar systems. But I also think Vancian magic is a really good way of handling magic. So
for those of listeners who may be furiously Googling, or those panelists who may be furiously Googling, what's Vancian style magic?
So Vancian magic, it comes from Jack Vance, who wrote the Dying Earth series, which is a series of books written over a couple decades that essentially you learn a spell from a book and it stays in your mind, and then when you cast the spell, you release that spell from your mind. And in Dungeon World, it means to cast spells that are called well, actually not in Dungeon World. In D&D, Prismatic Spray, for example, or colorful lights or whatever. But in Dungeon World, an example would be like Magic Missile is a Vancian style spell, as opposed to a ritual, which lets you do whatever the hell you want. So
okay,
sorry.
Or in comparison to the mage, for example.
Yes.
Gee, I wonder why I like the mage.
Yeah. No, so just to be clear, I think you could do it a lot better. The Fluxicaster, which was Cameron's prototype for the wizard in his
where it just turned spells into moves, basically. Yeah.
That's a good one. That's a good way of doing it. So
that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that.
There's also, if you've ever seen Mike Weiss's Abjurer and a couple of other, like he basically just has different schools of magic, each one as a different playbook, and he does the same sort of thing, right? Where instead of actual spells that you cast, there's just moves that are clearly magical in nature that don't require spell slots. They're not Vancian at all. They just give you moves that do cool magic shit. And that's another interesting way to go about doing it.
And I think it's Mark Weiss, actually.
Oh, does it Mark? Oh, thank you.
But you think
I feel bad because like he and I chatted about those a lot, but
Yohai, you think that the Vancian style magic is a sacred cow?
Yes, and I think even though people hate it, I think you could actually do a better job. I tried. I made a sorcerer playbook to try to fix some of the problems that I saw with the Dungeon World Wizard, and what it taught me is that magic is hard. It's really, really hard to make a magic user that is both balanced but flexible, and also not overpowered, OP, whatever, not OP. And the only contribution I think I made is that I figured out a way to do mana and instead of spell slots. And I don't know that that's better, but the whole idea was I like that class from D&D because you didn't have to worry about spell slots. You had spell points, and I thought that was so much, I don't know, more interesting. So, but yes, it's hard.
And I think you could easily, like, one of the nice things about the playbook model is that you don't have to be locked in, right? Like if a second edition had both a Vancian style wizard and then also had a more of a mage style wizard, like sort of, side by side with each other, and maybe just some guidance on which one to pick, I don't think that would in any way break the game, right? Because so much of the actual game at the table comes down to which playbooks happen to be getting used and how the players interact with those things. And I think that's great. I think that's a strength of the system.
Yeah.
But I would want to at least see a traditional style wizard, and probably a traditional style cleric in a second edition, but maybe baked in with an option for something similar to the mage and the Templar.
Yeah, I agree.
I will say things like, just kind of like a quick rundown list to David, because you keep asking us like what other things would we do. I mean, you just lived through a bunch of them. So advantage instead of +1, -1 forward, 3 abilities instead of 6. I would look to consolidating supplies, like all the expendable supplies, into something small and tight. There's just like a generic supplies thing.
Yeah.
Really kind of cut down more of an inventory slot system instead of a weight system, because people can look at slots and fill them in, but they can't fucking count.
It's true.
And I would probably, and this one might be getting into sacred cow territory, but I would probably not count coins.
Yeah.
Like I would probably go more for a bag of coins that was valuable, or an idol that was priceless, or something like that.
Well,
Yeah.
Cameron's been working on a wealth system for his project he's worked on multiple wealth systems, some of which I've play tested for him. And I'm sure he can speak to that more than anyone else here. But
anything to add to that?
No, just agreement. I think you could go for wealth or for valuable and precious and priceless items, and that I don't think that would be a sacred cow. I think you could make that change quite easily.
Yeah, I think the other big one that I would do is getting rid of. I think I probably would come down on the realm of using backgrounds and putting race as a look instead of an actual mechanical choice. I think that keeps enough of the elves, dwarves, halflings, etc. without. But I just think backgrounds are more interesting. I think you can do more with them, and I think they're better. And then the other big one that I would do is I would scrap bonds as a mechanic, and I think, like, inspired by the Apocalypse World 2nd edition bits where you are asking questions of each other, like which one of you has stood by my back during the darkest battle, or which one of you left me to die, or that sort of thing. Having that sort of to set the initial relationship, I think, is just stronger than the bonds that are already there. And you can do some other thing to just sort of track the change of relationships between people, just as an end of session question.
So if we're doing what would we like to see which is, I guess, I have a lot to say about that. But besides what you've already said, which is basically taking Homebrew World, taking the supply system and the inventory system from that, and I would actually add a little bit of Troika's inventory system as well, because I think it's kind of interesting, or Knave's inventory system, which is all basically the size of the object, takes up a certain amount of slots. There's a couple different ideas around that, but my biggest thing is I play a lot of one-shots, and for me, the biggest stumbling blocks are around what do new players trip over the first time they play, and also what can be kind of removed for longer term play, or not removed, but what is easiest to gloss over. So like a stumbling block is the 3 to 18 ability scores, because it's like, why do I have this table that tells me how much a mod is? Like, that's confusing to people, and I don't think it provides that much granular mechanical advantage. And then secondly, bonds are confusing because they haven't been able to establish this relationship yet, or there isn't, like, you just like pick from a list of ones that work for you, or you're expected to make them up. But I think I agree with Jeremy. Getting the characters to insert bonds into world creation, that's key to me. So like when I start a new one shot, I always go around the table and ask each person to name one truth about the world that doesn't conflict with the previous truth, and then I have them do it again. And if I could somehow integrate the world creation process with creating character relationships at the very beginning, and then keep that going as the game continues, so kind of like a ownership of mythology or ownership of lore mechanic that intertwines with character relationships, that would be really interesting to me, and would require, instead of changing something in Underworld, it would actually require adding a new rule system. And it's something that I've been working on my own, that doesn't go anywhere. But long term, if there was a section called world building that had a whole bunch of questions and mechanics and moves that you do as part of your regular play that helped not only create the world but also integrate players, that would be really, that's, if we're talking about what Dungeon World is missing rather than what to change, it is clear instructions and mechanics for developing a unique world. Because every time I play, we make our own world. And Dungeon World implies this, and it even says it straight out in some of the core rules, but it doesn't really help you. Like, everything I know about world building I got from Perilous Wilds, thank you very much, or other people I've seen online who've posted how they do it. And so that's, to me, that's the biggest core feature that's missing for me, is clear guidance on character creation and world building.
Yeah, and I would second that even more broadly, I think one of the things about the text in Dungeon World is it's not direct enough. Like it's not direct and it's not directive enough. Like I come from an instructional design background. That's what I do most of like about 50% of the time when I'm at work. And it's just there just aren't that many clear steps, right? That say, okay, what exactly do you, when you are asking questions, what are the 6 types of things that you need to ask questions about? What are the things that need to be established? Like how exactly do you, or when exactly do you make a move? Right. That is surprisingly vague in the text.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. We're getting later in the hour, so let's transition to things we want to make sure don't happen, or fears that we would have if there was going to be a second edition. I think we've already suggested like reverse compatibility. Is that a must for everyone, or is that like you could give it or take?
I think it is. I think it's a very important thing because if there isn't that kind of reverse compatibility, then I think you end up in a situation of a fractured community of those who want to play first edition or those who play second edition, and they don't want to talk to each other because their favorite playbook doesn't translate or can't translate over, or can't translate it over because the people who have written the new rules haven't provided support for that. Something that I had to do with Worlds of Adventure, both because I wanted to and because I knew people would also need it, is how do you translate over the previous system for HP, which is like a number plus your constitution modifier, not modifier, total, into a system that just has the totals as a standard thing. That's something that I had to provide guidelines for in case people weren't sure how to translate it over their favorite homebrew playbook.
Yeah, and an interesting thing, I was curious, because I've always had this sense that Dungeon World is still one of the most vibrant and well-supported by third-party systems, right, out there. So I went on drive-through last night and I looked, and if you look at Apocalypse World Engine, there are 866 items on drive-through RPG. And everything that is flagged as Dungeon World is also flagged as Apocalypse World Engine. And there are 504 things that are flagged as Dungeon World. And that means that there is 1.5 times as many Dungeon World products on DTR and drive-through as there are for every other PBTA game combined. And so that point of backwards compatibility and being able to reuse stuff that's already out there, I think that is really important, that even if it's not directly compatible, that you can at least see the line and very, very easily make the jump between them.
Well, and that speaks to keeping the spirit of Dungeon World alive, which is to make shit. People, I mean, besides the fact that it's Creative Commons, and I mean, largely because PBTA is so easy to hack, there is this kind of community of, hey, you made this thing. It's totally cool for me to make a clone of that thing, and I don't even have to ask you because this is just what people do. So, like, I was seeing people making versions of my playbooks or other, Cameron's playbooks, whatever, for other systems, and I'm like, that's cool. You want to use this random terrible playbook I wrote in this other system, like that takes 5 minutes to convert, and then you have this new thing. And I also, if I could answer David's original question of what shouldn't we do, if we did do a second edition, we shouldn't use uninspiring art. And I actually, a lot of people said on the poll that they didn't like the art in the English edition. And I am one of them. I think the art is boring and doesn't tell me about the game at all. The cover art does. The Nate Marcel cover art makes me feel alive. I love it. But a lot of the interior art is so uninspired. And I'm sorry, I don't have anything against the cartoonist. I just thought it wasn't great. But that seems to be overwhelmingly the opinion of the community is get good art that inspires new people who pick it up and feel like, wow, this makes me feel like I want to play a fantasy game instead of whatever that makes you feel.
And just more of it too, right? Yeah, there's so much white space in the book, and so much space that could be filled with awesome drawings from, like, Kenny Wajita or I mean, there's all sorts of new artists out there that could be tagged.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I would agree with all that.
Yeah, I agree. It could use some fresh art. I agree. Like, I think for the players and to honor the community and the creators, like, it would be a disservice to have a second edition that was not, if not completely reverse compatible, largely reverse compatible. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think I would also want something that it would be relatively trivial to put something together where there were, 3, 4, maybe even like 6 or 7 different sets of the playbooks, where the most commonly swapped in, swapped out variations were present, right? So drives versus alignment, bonds versus or something versus flags, right? Like having some way to sort of just easily put those in, put those out, and have just a different set of playbooks that you download and print out that are, like the human only playbooks, or that are the drive-based playbooks or the alignment-based playbooks. And it's a little bit more design work and content work to come up with in the beginning, but most of that stuff you can just re-flavor, and it doesn't end up being a lot of actual design work.
What do you think, Cameron?
I agree with that. I could see like an expansion of the existing, like, Dungeon World as one of the many hacks of Apocalypse World comes with a chapter on hacking the game, and that's important. And that's the kind of place where I'd want to see stuff like the heritage moves. If you wanted to say, if Dungeon World 2nd edition went the direction of moving races into looks, perhaps it would just be a matter of in the hacking chapter to say, hey, if you want that kind of stuff back in there, put in the heritage moves from, I'm afraid I don't know the creator
Planar
of the
Codex.
Thank
Jay
you.
Walton's
Yes.
Planar Codex.
Heritage moves that would just give your characters some more life and racial identity in that dimension, if that's something you wanted.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it kind of gets on. It kind of maybe solves the concern I had. Like, this is the next thing I would be concerned about. I'd be concerned about feature creep and trying to have too much. But this idea of like just having an extra section, and then the support of like playbooks where it says like, and these are the drive playbooks, like maybe that would fix my concern with the feature creep.
Yeah, I do think you're right to be worried, right? That like we're just, if you bolt in all of these additional things, it does become fairly bloated fairly quickly. Like even the Perilous Wilds and like the follower rules and the travel rules that are in there, they add a significant amount to the number of just moves that are in play. And move bloat is actually kind of a concern whenever you get into these things. You can do a certain amount by categorizing them of like when you would use each type. But yeah, no, I'm with you, David, that we would definitely have to decide what things to keep and what things to cut.
And I would point out though that anything is move bloat if you just completely don't use hirelings because they're terribly written and they're not an effective tool in the game. And everyone I know uses follower rules because they're just logical and make sense and not stupid. So good for that. Yeah, good job there. But and I think it's also I think that's one nice thing that the 2nd edition would do is unite on a mechanical level a lot of these disparate role systems that I think are confusing. So like we have one separate rule system for monsters, another one for follow or for hirelings, and then we have another one for locations, for steadings. And those could all be the same thing. They're all just aspects, and they could all be, or not aspects in that case, but they could all just be, person, place, or thing in this world, and you could have them all with moves. And in many ways, yes, you'd have move bloat, but at least it'd all be one overarching mechanic instead of 3 different role systems, one of which you'll just throw out the window.
I think it was Rayotis's idea to perhaps move steadings into a type of monster. I think it was like give them not necessarily HP and armor, but but moves to trigger while you're in that steading, or to apply the same to locations.
Like GM moves, right? Like give the town an instinct and a bullet list of GM moves. I actually thought that was Yohai's.
Yeah, okay. So it was Ray's idea to write actual. Well, so yes, Cameron's right. It was Ray's idea. I actually did it, and I wrote how to use locations. I wrote new location rules that basically make locations as monsters. Thank you very much, Cameron. But it was Ray's original idea. And that document is available on the interwebs. And I think some version of that, probably much better than the one I wrote, should be in a second edition, because I think it makes the creation of new towns and steadings much faster. And it also makes them interesting because there's like a move mechanic that you can actually have run into the players and such.
Or the alternative, I suppose, would be to fully implement the steading, like steading development rules like you would find for sectors in Stars Without Number, because that seems to be what these steading rules are meant to emulate, but they don't have that backup, similar to moves like corrals, which indicate a type of fiction but don't feel like they're fully supported, and so people just don't end up using them, and so that leads to coins not being used and this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into just another, I guess this is almost going back to things we would like to see. And Cameron, I think you and I have been kicking this around of something that sort of encourages play to skip over the time between adventures and just gets us from, okay, we wrap up, we all head home. There, the PCs sort of like trot off into the sunset. And instead of playing out necessarily when they get into the next town, we just figure out what kind of the next adventure is that we want to have, and then we jump media res directly into that adventure, maybe with some love letters to have burned up resources or set the tone, or otherwise kind of just drop us into the action. And having some sort of direct guidance on how to do that, I think, would be solid.
Yeah, I think the bolster move helps you get there, but it's so underutilized. It doesn't do like everything that you had just said, but it does some of the things that you said.
Yeah, something like Peter J. Hansen put together a version of John Wick's Dirty Dungeons for like, it's just a move, right? It's basically a move to have the players make up the next adventure, make up the next dungeon, and sort of give the GM currency and license to screw them later. And something like that, where you just sort of like do a love letter-esque between the scenes move to figure out where we're going next and queue up all sorts of interesting complications. Maybe it's not even a full move. Maybe it's just a questionnaire or a process. But I think that's something that has legs. I just haven't had a chance to really work something out.
All right, so we're coming close to the end here. We've got a few questions. I'll kind of pick out a few on here, but one question that we have from the audience is how do we fix the social move or parlay concern? Thoughts on that?
I have an opinion.
I think we all have opinions.
Let's hear them.
I think Jeremy should go. I think Jeremy should go first. No, because your parlay, because like I hate parlay. I hate that move. I think it's really annoying, but Jeremy has the best solution for it, I've heard. So
okay. So my version of parlay is when you press or entice an NPC, say what you want them to do or not do. If they have reason to resist, roll plus charisma. On a 10+, they either do as you want or reveal the easiest way to convince them. On a 7 to 9, they reveal something you can do to convince them, though it'll likely be costly, tricky, or distasteful. And then there's a PC-facing version as well. But the main idea is to get over the question of whether or not you have leverage to begin with. Just sort of be watching for the player or the character role-playing out some sort of push or enticement or putting pressure. And then the role basically makes the GM decide, okay, well, was that enough? Cool, let's run with it. And if it wasn't, it becomes sort of a discern realities in which the GM is then telling them what they could do to make it happen. And I've just found that in play, it it comes up a lot more than Parlay because you don't have the whole leverage requirement. And it leads to some really interesting role playing and decision making on the half of the players.
Cameron, any thoughts to add on parlays or other social dynamics that should be solved with moves?
I think we should either if we were to make a Dungeon World Second Edition, I would definitely go with either like Jeremy Strandberg's excellent parlay move and built-in interrogation mechanism for finding out what they would even want in the first place, because that's what makes that move tick. Or to go the other direction and employ a move like Read a Person from Apocalypse World to give players the ability to find out what the person would want as leverage, and then the ability to parlay for it. Maybe the parlay move, since we don't like it all that much, and I don't think there are many who do, maybe that could simply be like, there's in Fellowship, for example, it's phrased in such a way that you don't need leverage, but you do need the other person to be willing to listen. And that means that, for example, the move text applies to both PCs and NPCs equally, because the PCs obviously have the ability to say, no, I'm not going to listen to you. That's not good enough leverage for me. I'm not willing to listen for that.
So to add to that, in terms of social moves, I'd like to see moves around aid interfere that are more social. Like I often feel like aside from the fact that bonds are used for aid interfere, I have times that have come up in my games where a barbarian is trying to follow an appetite, and literally the only way they can stop the barbarian is by physically holding the barbarian down or by acting it out in roleplay. And I feel like there could be some cool social mechanics for that scenario. Cameron also wrote a move called Forge a Bond, which came with a GM move called Break Their Bonds, which I think has some cool similar concepts. You sit around a campfire and you forge a bond together, and then the GM later can do something called Break Their Bonds, which is kind of controversial because it's interrupting player relationships, and it's the GM doing it. But I thought it was really cool.
That's an
Since
interesting
it was
thought.
using their resources, yes.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I'd have to see that in play. Okay, another question we've got is it a bad thing that it can't be called Dungeon World?
Yes.
After all, you're not in a dungeon most of the time.
Oh, that's the name people know, and even though it's fairly inaccurate, and maybe that's an argument for what we need to do in Dungeon World Second Edition, is to make it more like D&D, which is dungeon crawling and overland travel and urban stuff. But it has to be called Dungeon World, otherwise what the hell are we talking about? We're talking about some other system, which we can totally make. I'm sure it would be awesome, but this is the community. This is what it's called.
I mean, the name was a joke originally, but
Yeah,
I've grown to love it.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah, I think even though it is not I don't go into dungeons that often when I play Dungeon World. Even though that's the reality, I think the brand recognition and the community buy-in to that is a really important rallying cry, especially in a small space like the indie community. Okay, one last question, and then we will sign off. Is making Dungeon World, if there was a second edition, is making Dungeon World OSR supplement compatible a goal for it?
Oh,
that's an interesting question.
How would you do that? The OSR supplements are all using these universal kind of retro clone rules or similar rules, and I already use supplements in my Dungeon World games, and they're almost all OSR and they work fine. So that would be cool, but I don't see how you can do that without losing the PBTA and Dungeon World specific rule set. But
I also don't know that you necessarily need to do that much, kind of like what you just said, right? Because most of the things that are statistics wise, you can just make up a monster on the fly. That is almost trivial to do. And one of the cool things about OSR style products is that they almost always give you enough fictional hook so that you can envision and should be able to play out that monster in just as well as if it was laid out as bullet point monster moves. So I don't know that that is a problem. What I think the harder thing to reconcile when in Dungeon World versus OSR is, I think I might get this term wrong, but Michael Prescott talks about this a lot, about the tangibility of the environment. And I was actually having a conversation, or Rob Alexander posted about this too recently, of the idea of that in Dungeon World, the prep that you do is fluid. It's all ideas of what could happen and what could be there. And that allows you to grab something from the probability cloud on a 6-, or when a player asks about it on Discern Realities. And maybe you didn't know that this thing was going to be in this room as a GM, but you just sort of like, oh, I know that I was thinking about I would have this. And yeah, they rolled a miss. Sure. Ogres, right? Suddenly ogres. But then that idea is really kind of at odds with the OSR idea of exploring a fictional space that is established and concrete, and that the challenge and the enjoyment of that style of play is largely the exploration of, okay, well, I drop a coin down the well, what happens? Or I do this. And if you look at the DM moves or the GM moves for Dungeon World, it's kind of hard to map a lot of those things onto just your basic, like, I interact with it like this, I try this, I take it off the hinges, those sorts of things. It is harder to reconcile those, and I think you can, but I don't like that. I think is the chief problem with reconciling them. They're making them
unfortunately, I don't own a copy of Vagabonds of Diffid, but I believe that was an attempt to merge a game like Dungeon World with the rules of the OSR and
compatibility, to have compatibility.
Yeah. I don't know how it deals with that aspect of the world being a concrete thing, but it certainly tried to implement some of that stuff. It had rules for translating over monsters, for example.
Yeah, I feel like it's a good in between, and people who are looking for something that's like Dungeon World but more compatible with OSR will find that with Vagabonds. Otherwise, though, it's not like Dungeon World at all. It doesn't have GM moves, and the 2d6 mechanic, which is unifying like it is in World of Dungeons, is not really. I own it and I've read it a few times, but to me it's wholly different. You could apply GM principles, but also I think the thing you were talking about, Jeremy, is awesome action versus tangible objects is, I think, what Michael Prescott called it. Chris, what's his name? The guy who made Into the Odd, he talks about that too, and it is, in my opinion, very incompatible with the two systems. And I use the content from OSR, but OSR stuff fundamentally is incompatible on a philosophical level with some of the stuff in Dungeon World. Yeah.
And I think you can get an awful lot of OSR style play when you are in a dungeon in Dungeon World, and the game works quite well with a tangible environment. Like, there's nothing about the rule set of Dungeon World that prevents you from having an established tangible environment and exploring it. It just makes it a little bit harder on, like, your misses, right? In particular,
right. Yes.
To come up with something interesting if you don't feel comfortable in shifting the probability around and quantuming your ogres. Right.
Well, that's what Ben Milton, the Questing Beast guy, that's what he calls that a consistent environment, a consistent world, consistent environment, where it's like OSR games allow the GM to have a consistent environment, even when having random dice tables. Like, and I feel like Dungeon World, because of the player collaboration style and also because of those misses, like what to do on a fail, those things really make it hard to prep beyond, what we all know as Dungeon World prep. And I think that's wonderful because I hate prep. So works for me, but yeah, I agree.
I don't know. You think we answered the question, David?
I think we did. All right. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to discuss this with you all. I hope that the viewers enjoyed it. This will be posted to YouTube in the near future. Thank you very, very much. I'll go ahead and end the broadcast now.